Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie. I am a Girl Scout from Grafton, Massachusetts, and I will be discussing neurodiversity as a whole throughout this podcast, in part for my silver award.
Beautiful. So, as we get started, how would you define neurodiversity in your own words?
I would define neurodiversity as the concept of having a differently structured brain or way of thinking than your sort of like holotype um individual, so to say. So it doesn't have to have specific requirements as one cannot speak or move or make eye contact. It's simply your brain is physically built different, which goes into the fact that autism and neurodiversity in general is genetic.
Beautiful. So, it's a different way of being and thinking compared to what someone might consider quote unquote typical.
Yes, like your sort of holotype of our species, if you will.
Awesome. So, there was a survey done recently of the general public, and it said that 1 in 7 people identify as being neurodivergent. What are your thoughts on that?
I am not shocked by that at all. It's true to say that a wide majority of people up until this point in science and understanding of neurodiversity were neurodivergent, except no one knew because we had very strict definitions until very recently, as I alluded to earlier in this sentence. Um, so yeah, also because we live in Grafton, well, we live in Massachusetts in general. Um, Neurodiversity is more looked into and accepted into our sort of culture in this part of the country. So that data does not shock me at all based on those two things.
So, what I'm hearing you say is that since we specifically are in a location where neurodiversity is something that people pay a little more attention to, you
Yes.
wouldn't be surprised if that number was actually a little bit higher.
Yes, compared to I don't know, if we were to go back even 40, 20 years ago into the 20th century, there was very preliminary research done on neurodiversity, more specifically what they called Asperger's. No one uses that definition anymore. That's sort of the outdated version of what we might call autism today. Um, so there's very few people who would be labeled as neurodivergent if they called it that. Um, the R word would have been used more likely. Um, and that was the medical term, if anything, for someone who is what we would call neurodivergent in the present. So, but as we sort of moved on in science and started actually looking into what neurodiversity is, we started realizing how broad it is and started identifying more people with more vast adjectives as neurodivergent. So that number of people who identify as neurodivergent has in fact skyrocketed in the past several decades. And as I said earlier, we are in a very embracive area of the country when it comes to neurodiversity. So those two things makes the data completely normal as far as I would guess.
So it seems like you're making the argument that it's not necessarily that there's more people who are neurodivergent, more just that we're getting better at actually being able to know what it is and label it more effectively.
Yes. I said this briefly earlier, but autism, and I say autism because I myself am on the spectrum, so it's the neurodiversity I talk about the most and am passionate about the most. But neurodiversities as um together as a sort of family, if you will, they're genetic. It's not something you can catch. So you physically cannot change anything except for the amount of people being born to change very the data as far as the number of people in the world who are neurodivergent. It's genetic. So it's as simple as we did not realize these people could be or were neurodivergent until recently. Girls could not be identified as neurodivergent until recently. No one did studies on neurodivergent um women or girls. It was solely men. So until very recently, the concept of a girl with autism or ADHD or OCD was unheard of, unless it was to the degree where it was visible to the untrained eye, like if they were heavily speech delayed or impaired, or even um, impaired in their movement or their range of movement. So, if that makes any sense, we had in fact been stunted in the past with our study on this concept.
So all in all, it's always been here, but we
Yeah,
haven't always been looking in the right places or in the right ways.
we have not.
So part of your project was collecting some data and feedback from people within the grafting community who either identified as neurodiverse, had someone in their life who was neurodiverse, or even were people like teachers who work with people who are neurodiverse. So in this survey that you conducted, you did ask, has anyone in your life been identified or diagnosed as having any of the following, and provided a really long list of neurodiversities.
Yes.
Do you have any guesses what the most frequent one was?
My guess would probably be either most likely ADHD or autism. I see those two um very high ranking when it comes to what people not only think of when they think of neurodiversity, but when I've met people myself who are neurodivergent, those two actually go hand in hand if you look into it. So those two would probably be my guess.
Those are the top two. And then the third one is OCD. And I'm guessing that does not surprise you.
Yes.
No. Are there any? So that was a really long list. Are there any on that list or any neurodiversities you think don't get spoken about enough?
I think in terms of that, the public understanding of um while they while I am speaking like partially biased on this because I have only a few out of this, like you said, extensive list of neurodiversities, um like comprehension of how the mind of someone with ADHD works. I myself do not have ADHD that I know of, but I know a lot of people that do. As I was saying, the concept of like how their mind works and the fact that they're not lazy or overstimulated all the time, even though they can be. Overstimulated was a forward choice. Um, that seems to not be as rooted in the general public's knowledge as other facts about neurodiversity. So I see a lot of people with ADHD struggle in school. I've heard stories of people with ADHD who struggle in the workforce early on or with relationships because of the way their mind is simply wired to work. So that was my
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that lends itself really nicely to our next topic that's coming up. But before we switch to that, I wanted to read some of the neurodiversities that people identified either with having or knowing someone that has, and see if any of them are anything you hear often or even as much as ADHD, for example. So someone put down dyslexia and dysgraphia. That was actually six people. What do you think?
oh
Do you think that gets as much attention as like ADHD?
um definitely not. Dyslexia and dysgraphia are definitely I know dysgraphia is something most people have not heard of. It's when you have harder time learning to write or write legibly. Um, I have a cousin that has both of these, I believe. Whereas the dyslexia, most people know, comes from the Latin word lexia, which means that they, in this scenario, they have a harder time learning to read and spell. And I've heard that their brains sometimes like switch up sounds, and it's really difficult for them to read or spell, as I said before. But yeah, I would definitely agree. Those do not get their um deserved recognition in the public knowledge, or the like when it comes to the public's knowledge at all. Those things seem to be a little underdeveloped, in my opinion.
Yeah, and some other ones listed were also schizophrenia, sensory processing disorder, Tourette's, Down syndrome. The list was really comprehensive. And just to circle back to what you said earlier about how it's always been here, but we're getting better at screening and knowing how to label things and how to really tease out different areas we haven't known before. What do you see the future as for neurodiversity in that kind of area? Where are we going next?
Well, it at least the way I interpreted the question as the future I hope for people with neurodiversity, because it is an extensive um it is an extensive minority of people in the world, whether it's been recognized or not. My hope for the community is that there will be a point where science is evolved enough to understand and respect neurodivergency, and like as I said like 30 seconds ago, be able to understand it even better, so that way we can develop better methods of helping people with neurodiversities adapt and overall succeed. Because a lot of people, I think, when they think of neurodiversities or people with neurodiversities, they think of one or two people, either A, the sort of like Sheldon Cooper or like Dr. Sean Murphy stereotype of a genius who very easily succeeds, or they think of someone who cannot succeed or cannot work. I don't think either of those are necessarily true. I think that we should be able to get to a point where neurodiverse people should be able to get jobs and be understood and respected by the public and have an important part in their knowledge. So I do know that a lot of times also when people are insensitive to people with these kinds of disabilities, a lot of it stems from a lack of knowledge of this topic. So that is my general hope for the future in these next several decades.
I think that's a really good hope. And I feel like the sentiment to close out with is that if you've met one person who's neurodiverse, you've met one person who's neurodiverse.
Yes.
Beautiful. All right. So this has been the first podcast of talking about neurodiversity in general. And thanks for listening.
Thank you.